Hello, everyone. First, I want to thank the Alexander Hamilton Institute for giving me this opportunity to give my talk today on this Columbus Day. My paper is entitled Just War, Rescate, and Caribs, Columbus and the Birth of the Indigenous Slave Trade. When Columbus landed in the Bahamas on October 12, 1492, he and his men were not encountering new, unknown peoples for the first time. In the 2 centuries leading up to Columbus's voyage, Europeans ventured into the Atlantic, colonizing the Azores and Cape Verde island chains, attacking the Canary Islands, and trading and raiding the coastal settlements of Africa. All of these interactions informed how Columbus reacted to the peoples and territories of what would become the Americas. Central to his previous experiences in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic Islands, and the African coast was the business of slavery. When attempts to establish trading relationships or more permanent colonies were met with hostility and violence in the Canary Islands or along the African coast, European intruders resorted to slave raids to make a profit. By the mid-15th century, regular shipments of Canarian, Moorish, and African slaves disembarked in the ports of Portugal and southern Spain. Slavery, already a common and accepted practice across cultures, was becoming an industry of its own. And its spread was justified by both military and spiritual goals. Faced with armed resistance to colonization, the Spanish responded with increased violence and the enslavement of combatants, as they later would in the Americas. Because these captives were pagans, taken in what was considered legitimate or just war, they could legally be enslaved, either in their homelands or shipped elsewhere for sale. Captives taken in just war, who were enemies of the faith, could be enslaved rather than killed according to the Siete Partidas, a law code dating from the 12th century and influenced by Roman law. Justifiable war included when one was under attack or fighting in defense of one's own sovereignty or the safety of an ally. Usually Christians were exempt from bondage. Thousands of Canarians were enslaved under this doctrine during the 15th century, in particular following in the wake of attacks on nascent Spanish settlements in Tenerife and Gran Canaria from 1477 to 1488. Columbus and his colleagues took this exact model of warfare and enslavement with them to the Americas. Concurrent with the slave trade emanating from the Canary Islands was the growing slave trade involving Portuguese merchants and explorers along the coast of Africa. While slavery was a common practice in the late Middle Ages across the Mediterranean world, expansion into the Atlantic made slavery into a much bigger business, especially for the Portuguese, who early on fulfilled the Spanish demand for African slaves. As a result, African and Canarian slaves arrived in the ports of southern Spain in much greater numbers. By the 1490s, there was even a small Canarian quarter inhabited by Guanche and Canarian servants and slaves in Sevilla, the very city that would become the center of the New World enterprise. African captives, considered to be legal, legitimate slaves because they presumably had been enslaved during war between African kingdoms, joined them. Thus, the Europeans could purchase African slaves captured in just war. Iberian experiences in the slave trade, both in Africa and the Canary Islands, would help to inspire the soon flourishing indigenous slave trade of the Americas. With the conquest of the Canary Islands drawing to a close by the early 1490s, as was the centuries' reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, merchants and explorers began to look even further out into the Atlantic in search of trade routes, new lands, and of course, opportunities for profit. Chief among the goals for increased exploration was the discovery of a quicker route to Asia. One of the principal supporters of this plan was none other than the now infamous and famous Christopher Columbus. Columbus believed that he could reach Japan and the riches of Asia within a few short months by simply sailing westward. Though we now know that Columbus's projections on distance and the size of the Earth were decidedly flawed, he did choose the best route to the Americas by sailing almost directly southwest from the Canary Islands. Columbus, along with 3 ships and a few hundred men, set sail from Palos on August 3rd, 1492. After a brief stop in the Canaries to refuel and gather more supplies, the group sailed for 33 days prior to making landfall in one of the Bahamas or Lucayos Islands on October 12th, 1492. Once on shore, Columbus took possession of the land for the King and Queen of Spain and named the island San Salvador, though the indigenous residents called the island Guanahani. Columbus and his men spent several days reconnoitering the island and exchanging goods with the Indians, though they were quite disappointed with the natives' wares. Columbus also concluded that the Indians, though generous, must be very poor people due to their nakedness and lack of weaponry. Quote, "To me, they appeared to be people poor in everything. Women and men walked about naked as the day their mothers gave birth to them, and none seemed to be older than 30 years of age. They do not have weapons, nor do they recognize them, because I showed them a sword and they took it by the blade out of ignorance." In exchange for food, cotton, and very small pieces of gold, the Spanish gave the Indians of the Caribbean glass beads, Castilian coins, and some European clothing. While the initial interactions between the Lucayans and the Spanish were peaceful, prior to continuing on with their explorations, Columbus ordered the capture of 7 Indians who would act as guides in their search for Cipango or Japan. Following this service, Columbus planned on taking the Indians with him to Spain, where they would be instructed in Spanish and Catholicism. They would then serve the Europeans as interpreters and intermediaries in return voyages of colonization to the Indies. Here, Columbus was following the model used by Franciscan friars in the Canary Islands and by the Portuguese along the coast of Africa. Though these men were not slaves per se, Columbus and his colleagues saw nothing wrong with their capture and forced removal from their homes, especially because they were not Christians nor people of the book. He also commented on their quick wit and docile natures, remarking that these characteristics would make them ideal servants. Quote, "They say and repeat all that we speak to them very quickly, and I believe that they will be easily made Christians, since it seems that they have no religion." This served as a foreshadowing of Columbus's future indigenous policies, many of which would be adopted by later conquistadors, explorers, merchants, and raiders. It also could reflect common European ideas regarding the inhabitants of the lower latitudes. Many Europeans, including Columbus, believed that they would find either very childish or monstrous populations, along with a plethora of gold and other mineral wealth as they entered the torrid zone, or the equator. The group spent several weeks sailing through the many Lucayos Islands, eventually landing in present-day Cuba. Here again, we see the same pattern as in the Lucayos Islands: initial peaceful interactions marked by the exchange of goods between the two parties. They were then followed by the violent capture of indigenous guides or slaves. In this case, he took 5 men traveling in a canoe near the shoreline of northern Cuba. He later took a couple of women and 3 children in an effort to pacify the male indigenous captives and to provide his crew with concubines, willing or not. In his journal, Columbus explained why he captured the women and children. Quote, "I did this because having women from their country with them in Spain will make the men, the indigenous, behave better and give them reason to negotiate with us." The Portuguese had learned this tactic after bringing many men back to Europe from Africa, who then refused to cooperate without the presence of their women. Columbus also hoped that the women, likely meaning those serving as concubines, would help teach the Spaniards their language and culture. These women would serve as the first intermediaries between the Europeans and indigenous of the Americas. Throughout the entire month of November, Columbus explored the Cuban coastline. But by December, he had reached its end and soon thereafter landed on the northwestern coast of Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It was here that Columbus finally gave up his belief that Cuba was the Asian mainland. It was also on Hispaniola that Columbus created his first alliance with a native leader, the cacique or chief Guacanagari of the Cacicasco or chiefdom Marien. After several days exploring the shoreline and encountering indigenous peoples both on the beach and in canoes, who all fled the Europeans. On a December afternoon, a group of 200 Taínos carrying their cacique approached the Spaniards. Excited to have finally contacted an indigenous ruler, Columbus offered the cacique food and invited him aboard his ship. The two men then had some form of limited conversation, during which they also exchanged gifts. Columbus gave Guacanagari a pair of red shoes, amber beads, orange-scented water from Seville, and the sheets from his very own bed. Reciprocating, the cacique Guacanagari provided the explorer with a few pieces of worked gold and a belt. In the following days, many more Indians approached the Spanish ships, all seeking to gain some of the European goods. It seems as if they were already becoming a valuable part of the larger Caribbean exchange network. The alliance between the two groups was immediately put to the test when Columbus's principal ship, the Santa Maria, ran aground on Christmas Day. In order to salvage the supplies aboard the ship, Columbus sent a message to Guacanagari, requesting help unloading the ruined vessel. In response, the cacique sent a large number of people in canoes to help the Europeans save what provisions they could. The loss of the ship forced Columbus to leave a group of men behind, since there was not room on the two remaining vessels for all the Europeans to return. So near present-day Port Paix on the northern coast of Haiti, the Spaniards built a small fort named La Navidad. Housing 39 men, the outpost was completely dependent upon the goodwill and help of its indigenous neighbors. Though the Europeans did have some supplies, they would rely on Guacanagari and his people for protection, information, and food while they awaited Columbus's return. Following his triumphant return to Spain, complete with his retinue of captive Taino Indians, Columbus traveled back to the Caribbean in October of 1493, this time heading for the islands to the southeast of Hispaniola first. It was in the islands of Guadalupe and Dominica that Columbus and his men first encountered Carib Indians that he had heard referenced on his first voyage. The Taino, the indigenous group of Hispaniola and the Greater Antilles, referred to their southern neighbors as Caribe, while the Lucayan Indians of the Bahamas called them Caniba. Per his interactions with the Tainos, Columbus was convinced that the Caribs were savage, warlike peoples, and what they found in the Lesser Antilles only confirmed their suppositions. The royal physician from Sevilla, Diego Alvarez Chanca, described the discovery of 4 or 5 human arm and leg bones lying in an abandoned hut on the island of Dominica. Then they found a neck bone boiling in a pot, along with leg bones hanging from several huts in Guadalupe. These discoveries proved to the travelers that the island's inhabitants were indeed the Caribs that the Tainos supposedly feared. The evidence of consumption of human flesh led Columbus and his men to also deduce that the Caribs were cannibals. It was this practice that Columbus and the Spaniards would later use to justify the enslavement of Caribs for decades to come. While it is possible that the inhabitants of the Lesser Antilles did consume human flesh, especially given their cultural and geographical proximity to the Indians of Brazil, it is unlikely that they did so as part of their regular diet or to the extent that the Spanish reported. As the French, Dutch, and Italians soon discovered during the colonization and exploration of Brazil, the custom of cannibalism was much more complicated. It soon became clear to those that spent more time with Brazil's Indians that the act of cannibalism had very specific and complex political and ritual significance. This was especially true for leaders of a tribe who sought to capture and then consume their enemies to avenge the deaths and probable consumption of their own loved ones. Such ritual cannibalism would make sense in the Caribbean context as well, because the Tainos claimed that the Caribs ate those men they had captured during conflicts. However, little evidence has been found to support cannibalism, at least widespread in the Lesser Antilles, outside of the reports emanating from Columbus and a few other very early exploratory ventures. Regardless of the type of cannibalism actually practiced by the Caribs, if any, Columbus and his men greatly exaggerated the custom to promote their own objectives. They also overstated the animosity between the Caribs and the Taínos. While it is possible that the Caribs did engage in some cannibalism and that they were enmeshed in some form of conflict with the Taínos of the Greater Antilles in the late 15th century, Columbus, Chanca, and the other early chroniclers probably would not have fully understood the Taino-Carib dynamic. In fact, the Caribs and Taínos had much more complex and evolving relationships, including both peaceful political alliances and kinship networks, but also violent raids to capture religious symbols and probably women. Why then would Columbus and the other Europeans create such a clear dichotomy between the Caribs and the Taínos, with the Caribs playing the role of the villain? This can at least partially be explained by miscommunication. When Columbus first met with Guacanagari and the other Taínos of Hispaniola, the Indians spoke of or gestured to an enemy that lived to the southeast that they called Caribs. According to Columbus's writings, Guacanagari described an island the Taínos called Quarry, which was, quote, inhabited by a people who are regarded in all the islands as very fierce and who eat human flesh. They have many canoes with which they range through all the islands of India and pillage and take as much as they can. Perhaps misinterpreting the account, Columbus concluded that the Taínos feared these peoples more than anyone else, partially because the Taínos were such peaceful and cowardly people, at least in his eyes. As can be seen in his later actions, Columbus seems to have used the Taíno fear of the Caribs to paint himself as the protector of the good and cooperative Taíno Indians, and he was simply punishing the bad Carib peoples. Despite the Caribs' bellicose reputation and association with cannibalism, Columbus's men actually met very few Indians on Guadalupe. In fact, they were only able to capture 8 men. Most fled to the mountains when they saw the Europeans approaching. Of these 8 men, 6 were Taínos from Puerto Rico. In addition to the 8 men, the party took 12 women and some children, all of whom they assumed to be captives of the native Caribs. Another chronicler, a friend of Columbus's from Savona, named Michael Cuneo, described the captive women as being, quote, very beautiful and fat, between the ages of 15 and 16. It appeared then that these women were well treated by the inhabitants of Guadalupe, whether or not they were concubines, wives, or slaves. Throughout the 8 days that Columbus and his men remained on Guadalupe, they continued to encounter both Taínos and Caribs, taking many by force, though some came with them willingly. Of note is that the Europeans could only tell the 2 groups apart by hairstyle, with the Caribs wearing their hair very long, while the Taínos preferred a shorter bob-like haircut. The real question remains how the women and men of Puerto Rico came to be on Guadalupe in 1493. Were they truly slaves captured during raids, and were the men destined to be eaten, as the Europeans believed? If so, why were they still alive and allowed their freedom on the island? Or had they served as gifts to solidify recent alliances between the Taínos of Puerto Rico and the Indians of Guadalupe, as archaeological evidence suggests? Whether or not these men, women, and children were from Guadalupe, were visiting the island, or were in fact slaves of the Caribs, Columbus sent them all to Spain, where they would serve as examples of Caribs, a people perfect for enslavement. Only a few days after sailing from Guadalupe, a canoe carrying many Caribs, women and men, attacked the European vessels with arrows. In response, Columbus and his men captured the canoe and all of its inhabitants. We have no further account of these indigenous slaves, but it is likely that they were sent to Spain with Antonio Torres in February of 1494, when he returned to gather new supplies for the nascent colony of La Isabela. By the time of Torres's return trip to Spain, on which he also carried a report by Columbus to the monarchs, the admiral had formulated a plan and rationale to enslave the Caribs. First of all, the indigenous slaves would receive Catholic education, thus saving their souls, and those who displayed talent could serve as the perfect interpreters and guides for the eventual conquest of all the Carib islands. Secondly, the majority of Carib slaves could be put to work in Spain or in the Canary Islands. To collect sufficient slaves for both purposes, Columbus advocated several caravels be sent to the Caribbean to hunt for and capture Caribs. These slaves could then be traded for all of the supplies and food that the colonists would receive from Spain. Essentially, the slaves would serve as payment. He would adopt the same design regarding the Taínos of Hispaniola as they turned against him and the other Europeans. As early as 1494, we can see the very beginnings of the commodification of indigenous slaves. After a brief stop in Puerto Rico, the group continued on to Montecristi, a harbor nearby the hastily created settlement of Navidad, to hopefully reunite with the 39 men left behind the previous year. Unfortunately, all that was left of the colony were a few decomposing bodies and smoldering ashes. Though there are many theories as to the causes of the massacre, the Spaniards likely fell victim to an attack by the powerful cacique Caonabo. Caonabo led the Cacicazgo Maguana, located in the Cibao or central mountain range of the island. According to Guacanagari and many of his subjects questioned by Columbus, caciques Caonabo and Maireni had recently conducted a surprise nighttime attack on both Navidad and Guacanagari's village. During the fight, both settlements were burned to the ground and many Indians were injured, including Guacanagari and the upper thigh. It was during this assault that the remaining Christians had died, with some dying earlier from disease and infighting. As one might expect, the Europeans did not immediately believe Guacanagari's innocence. The mistrust was only made worse when they discovered valuable Spanish goods in Indian huts, objects that the Spaniards would not have willingly bartered, including a Moorish mantle taken during the Reconquista. This tension is likely why Columbus chose to establish his first real colony several miles eastward instead of rebuilding La Navidad. It is still uncertain whether or not Guacanagari was involved in the planning of the confrontation or was a victim himself. In the end, though, Columbus did not exact any revenge on Guacanagari and maintained him as an indigenous ally for many years, an arrangement from which both men benefited. Before Columbus could investigate the threat posed by Caonabo, he had to build a new settlement from scratch. Columbus and his men left the ruins of Navidad and sailed eastward along the northern coast of the island. It was not until nearly a month later that the group decided upon a site, dropping anchor and performing the first mass on January 2nd, 1494. They named the new colony in honor of the Queen, La Isabella. Even though the settlement was abandoned within 3 years due to widespread illness, lack of resources, and violence, the site initially proved to be an auspicious one because the fort was in a kind of frontier zone where no one high-ranking cacique ruled. In fact, La Isabella seems to have been located in between the territories ruled by the Macari cacique, Mayabonex, and the Taino caciques of Marién and Magua. Perhaps because La Isabella lay in this borderland, no cacique was immediately threatened by Columbus and his men, and they were temporarily safe from another attack. But Spanish incursions into the interior of the island soon triggered violent Taino resistance. Only a few weeks after the founding of Isabella, Columbus sent a group into the interior region in search of rumored gold mines. After finding evidence of gold, Columbus organized a much larger expedition of over 400 men, who marched south and established a fort called Santo Tomas in March 1494. This settlement provoked the first war between the Taínos and the European colonists. Upon returning to La Isabella, Columbus almost immediately received word that cacique Caonabo was already threatening the newly established fort, which lay in the heart of his Cacicazgo. In response, Columbus sent a few hundred more men, led by Alonso de Ojeda, to reinforce the fort's commander, Pedro Margarit. With Ojeda's forces, he sent instructions on exactly how to deal with Caonabo and his people. Columbus's orders offer insight into his plans for the Taínos and their pacification. His very first command was to ensure that no innocent Indian was harmed. However, in the very next sentence, Columbus prescribed cutting off the ears and noses of any Indian caught stealing from the Spanish soldiers. In exchange for food, the soldiers were to give the Taínos trinkets, including silver hawks' bells. If any indigenous community refused to turn over supplies, the Spanish had permission to take anything they needed by force. It would appear that the Taínos had few options when facing the invading Europeans. They could either give up all of their food stores, risking famine, or anger the soldiers, bringing about dismemberment and possibly death. Columbus did not limit his instructions to the general treatment of the island's indigenous peoples. He also gave very specific orders regarding the cacique, Caonabo. Despite the cacique's recent threats against Santo Tomas, Columbus sought an alliance with the leader. He ordered Marguerite to choose 11 discreet men to deliver gifts to Caonabo in the hopes that this demonstration of goodwill and friendship would gain him a new native ally, as well as an avenue to indigenous stores of gold. But Columbus also added that if the cacique refused to meet with his delegation, Marguerite had permission to capture Caonabo using any means necessary. Marguerite actually followed none of these orders, and while Columbus resumed his explorations of Cuba and Jamaica, he abandoned his post at Santo Tomas, returning first to La Isabela and then to Spain, along with many other dissatisfied Spaniards. Las Casas related that the men Marguerite left behind quickly spread out about the island, wreaking havoc on the indigenous population. Not only did the soldiers seek large quantities of food, which the Tainos did not have, but they also violated hundreds of Indians. These actions not only revealed the Spaniards' disrespect for the Tainos of the island, but also for their own leader. Columbus's inability to control his men would continue to plague the nascent colony, eventually forcing the crown to intervene and arrest Columbus. Despite the behavior of the colonists and the power that Caonabo could harness from his ally and brother-in-law, Behechio of the Jaragua Cacicazgo, the cacique did not attack the Europeans. While his reasons for inaction are unclear, it is possible that Caonabo did not view the Spanish as a serious threat after Marguerite and most of his soldiers abandoned Santo Tomas soon after its founding. When Columbus returned to Isabela, however, at the end of September 1494, he immediately sent another envoy, this time of only 10 men, led by Ojeda, to Caonabo. They were to exchange gifts with the cacique and invite him to come to La Isabela to meet with Columbus. When he refused to travel to Isabela, the Spaniards instead captured him, taking him by force. The captivity of such a powerful cacique ultimately instigated the first full-scale war against the Europeans. The violence began in late 1494 when the Macquarie cacique named Guatiguara attacked the sparsely populated fort of Magdalena. The Spaniards had erected this fort during their march to Santo Tomas. During the assault, between 10 and 40 Spaniards were killed. In retaliation, Columbus sent an army to defeat and pacify Guatiguara. During the conflict, the Europeans captured over 1,000 Indians, who were all marched to La Isabela in February of 1495. Because these Indians had violently attacked the Europeans, they could legally be taken as slaves through the practice of just war. Columbus chose 500 of the 1,600 captives to send to Spain, along with Caonabo, while the rest were partitioned out to those Spaniards who wanted them. Of the 500 slaves sent to Spain, 200 died during the journey, while the fate of the other 300 is unknown, though Cuneo did not think they would live very long in the much colder climate of Europe. Thus began the indigenous slave trade. And the Taino rebellion soon spread from Magdalena and the Macquarie. In fact, following the capture of Caonabo, an alliance was solidified between the other three most powerful caciques on the island, Behechio, Guarionex, and Higuanama. By March 1495, Columbus possessed only one Taino ally, Guacanagari. Faced with future attacks on La Isabela and Santo Tomas, Columbus and his brother Bartolome marched an army of 200 soldiers, 20 horsemen, attack dogs, and 3,000 Indian allies led by Guacanagari into the Cibao to pacify the League of Caciques. Upon reaching the Central Valley, the Europeans set up a small palisade atop what would become Santo Cerro. In addition to the strategic advantage, the mountain was located very close to Guarionex's largest settlement of Magua. Within days of reaching Santo Cerro, Columbus and his men were attacked by Taino warriors, numbering anywhere from 5,000 to 100,000, depending on the account. After a day of ferocious fighting, the Spaniards were forced to retreat to Santo Cerro, and it seemed as if the Europeans would suffer certain defeat. However, the following morning, they awoke to find the valley deserted. Columbus believed this signified the submission of the Tainos, and many of Columbus's men attributed the miraculous victory to the Virgin of Las Mercedes. Against all odds, Columbus was able to negotiate a treaty with Cacique Guarionex. Why the Taino fighters actually abandoned the battle and why Guarionex decided to submit to Columbus are two questions still left unanswered. One of the best hypotheses regarding the surrender is that of double misunderstanding. It is possible that the Taino warriors and caciques believed the battle to be over when the Europeans retreated in disarray back to their base on Santo Cerro. Therefore, they too returned to their respective cacicazgos after what they believed to be a victory, sure that the Europeans would eventually leave. With his allies and support gone from Magua, Guarionex may have felt vulnerable, and that his best option was simply to negotiate for peace with Columbus and his men. Regardless, this was the beginning of Columbus's imposed tribute system, whereby every Taino living in the Cibao region of 14 years or older had to pay a Flemish hawksbill full of gold to the Spanish crown every 3 months. Eventually, especially in other regions lacking in gold, cotton or other spices could be given in gold's stead. Columbus then returned to Spain in 1496, bringing with him the gold collected the previous year and another 30 Indian slaves. He sold these slaves in the markets of Sevilla for 1,500 maravedis each. It soon became apparent that the Tainos could not fulfill Columbus's tribute demands, and the resulting rebellions all increased the number of Taino slaves transported to Spain each year throughout the 1490s. By 1497, Guarionex was again in rebellion against the Spanish government, which Columbus's brother Bartolome administered from the new capital of Santo Domingo on the southern coast. Bartolome quickly quelled this rebellion, with large Taino casualties, and captured Guarionex. Interestingly, the Spanish almost immediately freed Guarionex in an effort to regain his alliance and power over the Indians of the Cibao. Through the cacique, the Spanish could guarantee the cooperation of the Tainos, including the delivery of tribute. Guarionex was to act as a puppet ruler for the Spanish, the first of many that the Europeans would install in conquered territories. Guarionex's freedom was brief, due to an ill-fated alliance he made with the rebel Spaniard Francisco Roldan against the Columbus government. Roldan rebelled when Bartolome began preparations to move the capital of the colony from La Isabela to Santo Domingo. Initially, Roldan secured an alliance with Cacique Guarionex and the other Tainos of the Cibao. But shortly thereafter, he moved his community to the Jaragua Cacicazgo in the southwestern corner of the island. Further away from the central Spanish government in Santo Domingo, Roldan created an alliance with the then Cacique Vehechio and his sister, Cacica Anacaona. After Behechio's death, Anacaona continued to benefit from Roldan as she was able to avoid regular tribute payments and much interaction with the larger Spanish government until 1503. On the other hand, Guarionex's brief alliance with Roldan proved to be his downfall, as it prompted another attack on the cacique when Columbus returned to Hispaniola in 1498. When Guarionex realized the dangerous position he was in, he fled the Cibao and found shelter with the Macari cacique Mayobanex in the north of the island. This alliance only further motivated Columbus, who led a force through the northern mountains, capturing both caciques along with as many Indians as they could. The Spanish considered all of these Tainos and Macari to be slaves and shipped them to Spain. 5 ships transported the 800 Taino slaves taken in just war to Spain in the fall of 1498. In Columbus's accompanying letter, his intentions to create an indigenous slave trade become even clearer. He wrote, quote, "In the name of St. Trinidad, I send all of these slaves that can be sold, along with Brazil wood. Of these, if the information I possess is correct, we can sell at least 4,000. And because in Castile and Portugal and Aragon and Italy and Sicily and the islands of Portugal and of Aragon and the Canaries, many slaves are used up, and I believe that fewer are coming from Guinea. These Indian slaves can be sold for 3 times the price." Later in the letter, Columbus also mentions that in addition to the Indians of Hispaniola proper, there were many more who could be enslaved, especially the Caribs on neighboring islands. In Columbus's opinion, until larger sources of gold could be found, the key to economic success in the Indies was the indigenous slave trade. Even as Columbus and his fellow Europeans developed an indigenous Atlantic slave trade, Queen Isabella questioned the practice and its morality. In 1495, she postponed the sale of the majority of the 500 Indians Columbus shipped to Spain until conferring with scholars and theologians to determine whether or not they should be slaves. She also sought a more complete description as to how the Indians came to be slaves and why they were sent to Spain. A full year later, no decision had been reached. And while little documentation exists to determine the fate of most of these Indians, at least 50 were finally sold to Juan de Lescano to serve as galley slaves. By 1500, the queen had come to a decision. Perhaps after seeing the growing numbers of Taino slaves arriving in the ports of Andalusia, declaring the Indians of the Americas to be free persons and subjects and vassals of the Spanish crown. As vassals to the crown, the laws of Spain extended to the Indians of the Caribbean and in theory prevented their abuse at the hands of the Spanish colonists. Isabella even went so far as to order the return of all the surviving Indians that Columbus had brought to Spain. By the summer of 1501, only 21 of the original 500 were still in the possession of the crown, and one of them was too sick to travel. The other 20 men and women did accompany the first large contingent of Franciscan friars to journey to the Americas in 1502. In addition to the Indians already in Spain, Isabella also tried to protect the future for those in the colonies. In her 1501 instructions to the new governor of Hispaniola, Nicolás de Ovando, she made it clear that while the Indians of the Caribbean were to serve the Spaniards, they were not, in fact, their slaves, but vassals of the crown. The Indians also had to be converted to Catholicism and be treated well, quote, as our good subjects and vassals, and that none should be hurt or suffer any indignity. Ovando and the other colonists were to be especially respectful of the caciques, who would make sure that their subjects obeyed the crown orders. Nevertheless, there still existed two ways to obtain indigenous slaves legally. One, if he or she was already declared as a slave, and there existed proof of this status, or through just war. So Spaniards could still legally purchase or trade for indigenous slaves taken captive prior to the arrival of Europeans in the Caribbean. This practice is known more broadly as rescate or ransom. They could also still enslave any Indians captured during warfare. For a time, it seemed as though Columbus's dream of indiscriminate enslaving throughout the Caribbean, especially of Carib islands, was not to be. For a brief period, then, the enslavement of most America's native peoples was illegal, with perpetrators of the crime actively punished by the crown, at least if the Indians were transported to Spain. However, only 2 years after her initial decree, Isabella was already making exceptions to the ruling against the enslavement of the Indians of the Caribbean. The first Indians to suffer from her reversal were the Caribs of the Lesser Antilles. In 1503, it became legal to enslave all Caribs or other Indians who violently resisted Spanish governance and Catholic conversion. This change in legislation essentially opened Pandora's box, allowing for unscrupulous colonists and merchants to deem any unpacified Indian as a Carib. As a result, many Taino, along with other indigenous groups of the mainland, would be wrongly designated as Carib, accused of cannibalism, and carried off as slaves to Hispaniola. In 1503, Isabella designated the islands of San Bernardo, Fuerte, and Barra, the ports of Cartagena, the Venezuelan coastline, and anywhere where the cannibals are, as Carib lands. Interestingly, and demonstrating the purely economic character of the designation, none of these lands corresponded with Columbus and Cuneo's reports of cannibalism. Instead, the territories marked as Carib were those close to areas the Spanish believed to hold mineral wealth. Between 1509 and 1512, the rest of the Lesser Antilles and much of Tierra Firme, or the mainland, were added to the list. Any method used to capture the Carib slaves was legal, from rescate to extreme violence. From the sale of these slaves, the crown expected to receive a fifth of the profits, becoming openly involved in the slave trade and its revenue. The merchant Juan de la Cosa commanded one of the first assaults against the Caribs, attacking the island of Codego, located at the mouth of the port of Cartagena in the summer of 1503. During the raid, Cosa captured 600 Carib Indians, many of whom were women and children. Small slaving expeditions continued to capture Carib Indians from 1503 forward, but it was not until the massive depopulation of Hispaniola Taino population that the slave trade really exploded. This depopulation began in the campaigns against the rebellious Taino caciques in the late 15th century, continuing apace into the early 16th. Concurrent with the legalization of slave raids against Carib Indians was the renewal of the taking of Tainos and just war on the island of Hispaniola. While Isabella prohibited the enslavement of any peaceful Indians in the Americas, she also decreed that they should labor for the Spanish colonists in the construction of towns extraction of gold, and production of food. If the Indians refused to work, they could be forced to complete these tasks, but always as free men, not as slaves. This contradiction would soon become apparent. When Governor Ovando arrived in Español in 1502, he faced almost immediate resistance in gathering the Taínos to labor for the Spanish in their settlements and mines. The first cacique to rise against the Spanish and their demands was Cotubanamá, a lesser cacique of the Higay Cacicazgo, located in the southeast corner of the island. First, many of the caciques of Higay told the Spaniards that they could only pay a third of the tribute owed. During ensuing negotiations, a Spanish attack dog killed a lower cacique. To avenge his death, and likely to avoid paying any more tribute to the Spaniards as well, all of the Taínos of Higay rose up. Under the leadership of Cotubanamá, the Indians killed 8 Spaniards on the island of Saona. Upon learning of the uprising, Ovando sent 400 to 500 Spanish soldiers to punish the cacique and his people. According to Las Casas, what followed was a massacre in which hundreds of Taínos perished of all sexes and ages. Cotubanamá himself was hanged along with another 13 men. The Spaniards took many more as slaves, before which they cut off one or both of the Taino captives' hands and sold them in the growing town of Santo Domingo, though some were still sent to Spain. Each Spanish soldier led between 10 and 20 Indian slaves in chains on the journey back to Santo Domingo. If this accounting is accurate, a minimum of 4,000 slaves were taken from Higay. In conclusion, in less than a decade, Columbus's plan to profit from the enslavement of America's indigenous people was coming to fruition, and the trade only grew over the course of the 16th century, scattering hundreds of thousands of enslaved indigenous peoples across the Caribbean, and eventually in the Americas. And every other European power who came to the Americas would also participate in this indigenous slave trade. Thank you.